my God. Greetings, 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 greetings. Fucking greetings. Oh. Man, this shit right here, I'm about to blow y'all mind gonna be blown. My mind is still blown. I'm still processing. And this is a funny thing about it. I'm talking about delayed processing. Like this right here is not so much unbelievable, but this is going oh my gosh. Let's give honor to Source, to the Creator, to the Most High for making all this possible, to the ancestors known and unknown, for the highest good of all. Clap up for yourself. If you made it here, just know that you are here to get some shit, some information that could possibly trigger in, bringing some awareness to your current situation, experience something. This is huge just as I'm just gonna honestly say as a darker man. Like I told you, I don't proclaim to be a therapist. I don't have all the answers. I do not try to make it seem like at all what y'all call in the old world as a professional. No, I just do my own thing. I dig deep, I go within myself, I get clarity and I get insight. What most people don't see is like this what I'm about to cover is gonna be so big. This video was so amazing to where I know I had to see it. The therapist or the sister in there was talking about delayed processing. And that was so big. I was like, whoa, what is delayed process disorder? I do have it pulled up, but y'all know when I pull stuff up, I relate it to myself. It's like telling a storytelling. Then she also mentioned delayed grief. She spoke about how sometimes what we're going through, we're not trying to avoid it. Some people avoid it because that's their programming. They don't know anything else. Delayed processing disorder has a lot to do with our bodies catching up with an experience or something that has happened to us later on, maybe in our years, such as like an unresolved emotion, things I've been speaking about, which is complex PTSD. I was fucking blown away when I'm like researching and learning these things about myself. I'm like, whoa. This explains a lot to where so many people, and I can say from my demographics from experience, have dealt with so many things traumatically when they're young, to where now I can honestly say that one of the things that was mentioned is where until we're out of survival mode, we don't even realize how much we have stored away or kept stored in our bodies, because the body keeps a score of these unprocessed emotions or memories and so forth. I would encourage people to look up these very things. Again, I'm just looking and seeing what I can relate to. When bro, delayed processing disorder, most commonly known as slow processing speed. It's almost like when you think of your body or you think about life, it's like you're a computer, updating, uploading. And when you think about undeveloped emotions, unresolved things, we're asking people from so many different walks of life to try to catch up to the main system, to this collective, what they call consciousness or database. Because at first when I looked up delayed process, actually I'm gonna pull it up, this is what it said before. Process delay is the time lag between when data or a signal enters a system and when it's fully processed, it delivers, caused by factors like network congestion, complex algorithms, encryptions, deep packet inspections, or the inherited the inherent limitations of hardware. It can also refer to cognitive delays where the brain takes extra time to process sensory input, common in the condition like autism. Whoa. In computing, the delay functions in programming languages pauses execute for a set time while the audio is used for effects like echoing. That's interesting. Neurodiversity. Okay, hold on. In computer network system definition, time routers device take to what is that? Hold on. The router's device to examine packet headers, check for errors, and determine forwarding paths. Causes router CPU speed, complex security checks. Okay, da 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 da. Sounds like Wi-Fi or something. Now the cognitive and neurodiversity. Information is stored and processed later, often after sensory overload, leading to a delay before response. Signs. Taking longer to respond to questions, needing more time to process complex instructions. Characteristics can result in recalling more details once the brain catches up. What the fuck? Yo, when I think about all of that, when you talk about the signs and the characteristics, just imagine people who have went through stuff and then their brains or their neurotransmitters, things that are not connecting because of how they have learned how to process things later. Or when they're asked a question, they don't immediately get a response because they're needing to process not only what they feel, but the memory and everything around that. Whoa. The definition in cognitive and neurodiversity definition. Information is stored and processed later, often after sensory overload, leading to a delay before response. Leading to a delay before a response. This makes so much sense when you think about how control and schooling and the abuse of power, how we're uncovering and removing so much shit that's been layered, especially when you think about psychological warfare or even how the brain processed, because there's another side to it, which I'm gonna get into, is talking about prolonged grief disorder. Like we talking about delayed grief, the symptoms and causes, like, oh my gosh. Marked sense of disbelief about the death. How many of us have went through that? You know how if something happens and something traumatic and their response is like, no, they're in disbelief. That says a lot about how to try to process that. Avoidance of reminders that the person is dead or unalive, and intense emotional pain such as anger, bitterness, and sorrow related to the death. Difficulty with reintegration such as problems. I need to put this on dark mode because this should be so bright. But anywho, difficulty with difficulty with reintegration such as problems engaging with friends, pursuing interests, planning for the future. Whoa. Okay, what I want to start with first. For one, delayed processes is very huge. I immediately think about things that are unresolved emotionally when I talked about whether PTSD or complex PTSD, the avoidance around things and what causes people to really probably respond completely different than what someone else would. It also mentions how delayed process disorder are commonly known as slow processing speed. I said that already. Formal diagnosis, but a challenge where the brain takes longer to receive, interpret, and respond to information after reading. Y'all mind me? I got gas, gotta let it go. A challenge where the brain takes longer to receive, interpret, and respond to information affecting the reading, writing, social cues, and task completions, often co-occurring with ADHD or anxiety, but distinct from intelligence. What does that mean exactly? It refers to a time it takes to absorb and respond to information, not the capacity from complex thought. Meaning a person can be highly intelligent but process information more slowly. You know what? Before all that motherfucking medication and all that stuff was thrown at us, labeling especially indigenous kids, or just, I already feel like it's, fucking being like a lab rat almost, wanting to put kids on certain things because we know that we learn completely different. And then having to already have to deal with bullshit in the world and at home, meaning a person can be highly intelligent but process information slowly. So that's what slow processing speed is distinct from intelligence. This is why, like, when I see people talk so fast, it reminds me of Maya Angelou, who said, like, people who talk fast don't want to be heard. And it reminds me of breathing because it says a lot about that. And then even the education system, all these different things where I feel like it keeps people in a almost like complex or narrow-minded thinking. I feel like closed off to experience of how other people think, how other people operate, and so forth. And I feel like the best teacher from that is observation. Meaning a person can be highly intelligent but process information more slowly, which can be mistaken for laziness or lack of ability. And often co-occurs with conditions like ADHD or dyslexia. Ain't that some shit? I just said that before even reading that. In effect, it affects efficiency in tasks like reading, math, and following instruction, but doesn't diminish deep overstanding or understanding creativity or problem solving skills when given enough time. What the fuck? This is wild how when you look at the systems or even shit that's structured like that for control, manipulation, and deception. And I tell myself, just outside of the realm of spirituality, it just shows how when you're talking about how so many things has diminished or like tried to undermine or devalue the power, the amazement, the intelligence around children very young. And I see this is why we're fucking studying. I see why movies and so much shit is created around that. Because you have scientists or whatever it is that can't make sense of the fact of how it is people or certain beings or certain things can just receive or operate in such a way and still have this heightened sense of intelligence or even connection to source. So this is amazing. This is fucking amazing because this reminds me of me before, quick someone to say that, oh, his attention to detail, his attention to this. Let me tell you something. I'm realizing that reading this brings so much awareness to the fact of how I've always known that I was intelligent. But when I look at how complex PTSD or, is it that? I believe it is is it that? It was something where I was talking about how, again, when there is an emphasis on, oh my God, this is giving me so much clarity on how a system has been put in place to try to support a certain people and or people of different shades, but still like private schools and all these other things, it seems like they have more of an advantage, but in reality, those who know that are street smart, those who know that have been through experience, seem to be the one that has almost like the true slight advantage because of the fact of how they have processed through, if you want to call it survival. And so now it may sound wild and far fetched, but it's bruh. Now you have people who have not been in that realm of things where they've had to be more self-sufficient or be in survival or go through some type of suffering. Now their brain has to process that shit. That makes sense. Now they have to go through things where they're not used to. Their body has to adjust, their mind, their mental, and so forth. And so, intelligence to me can be viewed so many different ways. It said intelligence measures overall cognitive ability to. Oh my God, I love this shit. Intelligence measures overall cognitive ability, including reasoning, problem solving, and understanding complex ideas. Meaning like IQ. This is so fucking funny. Because when I think about the structures and how so much shit has been built off the devaluing, the false empowerment of other people, keeping things from people. And what I mean by that is like keeping people from knowing the history, our story or certain things that are vital. Because if they don't know about certain things, I'm not talking about the good, the bad, the ugly. It's more so like what people have experienced. It can keep them almost narrow-minded to believing, again, this aspect of low self-esteem or making them feel less valuable than those who have access to private school or resources or money and so forth. But when I think about the fact of who I really see as intelligent, when it talks about problem solving, as the elder said, the greatest knowledge on earth is finding a solution to your problem. And when I look at who the fuck has survived and gotten through almost like the worst of anything, that says a lot about intelligence. That says a lot about the fact of there's something inside of us, deep, large within us, whatever has connected us, whether to source, whatever higher power, that there is a higher intelligence, which I call source, the most high, that even through the fact of all of this shit, this just gives me clarity on all things we already know. But when you have the powers that ain't no used to be trying to convince the people that you are like not even worth anything, the feeling of worthlessness. Oh, matter of fact, let me slide this over because that's one of the that's actually one of the damn, can I pull up another one? Oh yeah, I can't pull it up on here. That's actually one of the things complex. Okay, here we go. Complex PTSD. That's actually one of the things they mentioned. I love this shit. I love this shit because this is what I do. Okay, so when I look at complex PTSD, the symptoms are kind of similar to where you talk about. I mean, it all connects. Delayed processing disorder. And I was just telling one of the therapists about this, about how, again, I was saying, like, I've been studying or looking up complex PTSD. And again, going down the list, hypervigilance, hyperarousal, wow, emotional flashbacks, anxiety, disassociation, avoid certain situations, conflict avoidance, problem solving with self-esteem, problems with self-esteem, like the feeling of worthlessness or worthlessness, trouble regulating emotions, relationship problems. And it's so interesting because if you shit right here, bro. This exposes so much about how you have to be. All I can say is fucking bravo. to the forces, to the unforeseen forces, to the powers that used to be, to people who actually thought that they were going to get away with this shit. When you see what the world is geared towards, most of the collective are dealing with complex PTSD symptoms, bro. Hypervigilance, hyperarousal. When I look at a certain, I'm just going to say this, not all, but a certain race of people, and when I see what they prioritize and what they avoid, meaning the difficulty in them maintaining relationships, and this is a lot of us, but when I see at the time what the false empowerment of the hierarchy represented, it represented these things on a deeper level. All this avoided around what people have really went through. And so what I realize is a lot of people that are going through right now, and I'm highlighting indigenous people, and I'm highlighting people, where the focus has been, who brings up these topics about what has happened or transpired, and then the counter of people who avoid it. But now the very thing that they avoid, it's almost like they're being put through for divine intervention, because it's not about it's ha ha ha. It's more so no, they're going through almost like, as we're coming out of something, they're going in. And that can be for a lot of people. And that can be seen completely different. It's just like, as I recognize my healing journey, or my, whatever you want to call it, like this journey, I'm realizing I can relate to most of these things. It's like, again, things that I'm realizing as I move the fuck away out of survival mode, and people that were in that foundation, this is allowing me to process that which has not only been unresolved, but that which I need to resolve. In that, this is where I've learned that where I was told that I was not intelligent, that I was dumb, ain't shit, all this other shit, all these things, that the illusion that was cast upon me that, oh, dyslexia, ADHD, he needs this, all of that shit was literally to literally add more fuel to the fire of delaying what was being processed. When you see these foundations, it was literally keeping, people from coming into a higher awareness of who they are. In that individual aspect, you learn more about yourself. Ain't that fucking wild? Because how they'll put like this, oh my gosh. So this is the therapist was saying on the video how, like, in those moments where things are processing, because you could have done something yesterday and then there's this delay of the emotion. There's this memory that comes up. There's a flashback when you're dealing with complex PTSD, but there's a delay. Meaning, like, for most of you to have dealt with, let's say you dealt with sexual abuse, right? Or rape. I'm telling y'all, I've been in connections with people, and even with myself. I've recently gone through stuff, not that, but I recently went through stuff with someone to where I didn't ever see myself, and then it's so funny because I'm grateful for this. In the shelter, they actually offer service at a time that I was like, I realized I was rising in my ego at the time. They offered like sessions of therapy, like you can go in there, and shout out to, I ain't gonna call her name, but much love and respect to the therapists, all of them that was in there. And what was so interesting about, for me, they all were, darker women, or women of, indigenous, roots. And that was challenging for me because at that moment I was with my partner, who, again, her culture, her roots are completely different. She's a lighter shade. She would be classified as white or, Caucasian, if you want to, subscribe to those terms. And, naturally people are going to have their beliefs based off, you're gonna go off. Everybody's gonna base things off their either experience or past experience or what is familiar to them. And that immediately can bring up judgment or projection because of people because of people not having that what it talks about actually like dealing with complex PTSD symptoms is it can bring up from a darker woman who normally have lived 40, 50, 60 years that conflict or trust um, from what is the word I'm looking for? Um, that trust naturally that isn't between darker people and lighter people, especially in this country. And what is it called? There's a word I'm looking for. It was something I was looking for the word I really want to use. It's not on there. It is on there, but basically it's just the difficulty of trusting women like that, and that there's different perceptions or perspectives on that when it comes to being in that experience. And again, during that moment, I had rose in my ego when I realized like they were offering services for people to just come in there and talk and so forth. I realized in that ego aspect, a lot of things came up, and I feared talking to them because I was not trusting of women. Like I had deep trust wounds, like oh my gosh, because of so much of child abuse, violence, just the feeling of feeling like devalued and less than, just basically hopeless when it came to women. And that was my own personal experience to where I had to learn to get out of my comfort zone. So I did eventually develop great relationships with them and connections because I realized that was bridging. I had to get past what I was familiar with to where I had to learn how to build things with women, not just in a platonic way, but in a healthy way, in a way of honesty and truth, and building something on a healthy foundation, which I was not familiar with. And that took me over 30 some years. It's not to say I've never had healthy relationships with women, but the platonic thing was very important because I realized this is something I did not value. This reflected my value system that I developed from a belief system of what I only knew from a lens of a woman who treated men with such disrespect and other things as well. And again, these are things where I realized in my delayed processing, realizing how later on in my years and with even going to the therapy and finally having a safe place to express myself, there's still anxiety coming up. There still was so much shit coming up because I didn't know, I was telling myself like, whoa, no one in my family or the men in my family has never went to therapy, has never talked to anyone. And it was more than just therapy. It was more of me realizing like what was keeping me from continuing to suppress or repress these things. And in that, it was showing me more of also what I think it talks about in complex PTSD, because with complex PTSD, it's more of how you dealt with things long term, like child abuse or neglect, domestic violence, um, things like that, to where I realized I developed a lot of things, symptoms such as like relationship problems, like never knowing how to manage or maintain trusting relationships with people or forming healthy bonds and connections. That was very difficult to me, no matter. And then what can also, if you want to use the term narcissistic or controlling manipulation or whatever, womanizing pretty much, is my inability to realize my role in not only what I was putting other people through. I knew that there was a deeper level to me recognizing well, where the fuck is this pattern coming from? And this is where later on in the years, in processing this information, it seems like, again, things where when I distance myself, where I learn more of through learning between seclusion or isolation, but learning in that seclusion to not distract myself, because that can become a very easy thing to do as well, is to try to distract yourself. Because the thing about seclusion, what most people skip over, is that even in your time to yourself, people say, yeah, take time, but you have to realize, like, there is going to be things where the nervous system wants to relax. So this is where the anxiety, the uncomfortable emotions, the things unresolved, that is the delayed processing from my perspective. This is where you could be in a relationship, someone could have asked you, hey, why do you do this and do this? And naturally you could deflect or run away. But in that, trying to escape, which what we were familiar with, try to escape through abuse, like substance abuse, or escape through other things externally, I recognize that there comes a moment in time where you have to sit with these things. When you learn, like, have you developed these symptoms of dissociation, detaching from the mind, body, and so forth. Feeling like feeling like the world is unreal. Are you able to recognize that the relationships that you have encountered or dealt with reflects you? In your difficulty in trusting other people's, where did you learn that? Where did you receive that information? Informing relationships, is it just surface level? Is it just stuff dealing with finances, money? Surface things. And the reason why this is so vital is because it talks about, again, other symptoms of emotional difficulties. This highlights even developing and forming relationships, because I've told you before, and I've learned through the difficulty of not knowing how to sustain them or keep them, through relations with myself and other people. My inability to know how to manage and process my emotions and try to resolve that which was unresolved, I recognize, there will be moodiness and frequent anger and feelings of, emptiness, depression, so many different things that I knew nothing about, that I didn't know how to process. I didn't know or have any type of insight on. No one told me about this, especially when you just have education, sports, drugs, or whatever your demographics. A lot of this shit pushed in your face, which is just another form of suppressing it through escapism, repressing it through, after something happened, I'm just gonna push it down. And then you have other things introduced to you, like gangs or other stuff introduced you, like being exposed to or being sex being initiated in your life early. So many different things, which, again, if you grew up in violence, domestic violence a lot, that naturally kept me running away. Like, I'm telling you, when I was young, I would literally be in the woods walking. I would do anything to avoid coming home. And it's certain things I realize in learned behavior patterns now, to where in feeling safe again and recreating what emotional safety is, that delay of what I went through with people allowed me to realize, in regulating my nervous system and processing those emotions, I'm recognizing what is healthy and safe for me. And in that, this is where I don't want to be around people, if that makes sense. Because I'm recognizing, now even more so, these things that I'm learning about myself in them. And it can be challenging in a relationship or in something where if you don't feel a sense of belonging or secure, then you can naturally not want to engage. And that's been a process for me, because I'm recognizing how much I have or was in survival. Now maybe to process things, I'm able to recognize, oh shit, I was abused. I was neglected. And what the familiarity around it is that energy, no matter how far you get away from a mother or father or someone else, that energy or that experience due to what's familiar can show up in an individual, a marriage, a partnership, a business, so many different things. And that's been something that I don't ever want people to think, because I used to try to think like, am I avoiding, am I running from stuff? Or am I trying to realize like I just need a moment to process these things? And so, you know, that's another thing that's very important. I'm recognizing like where there was a pattern where, okay, I would jump into another relationship, but I'm sitting here telling myself, well, what am I trying to avoid that I need to face within myself? That I need to find a resolution, or solution now with whether whomever I'm with. And that's what I'm realizing, like, in distance, it's very helpful for not only yourself and other people, but it gives them an opportunity to process if they're willing. Or the challenge in that is that a lot of people aren't willing, have the courage, because those subconscious fears or those things that have been stored in the body for so long. And when you're talking about people who have dealt with domestic violence most of their life, so it makes sense where I'm realizing, like, coming into this awareness, where support, whether if I know better, I do better, but also realizing the effects it has had on me and other people, cycle breaking, breaking generational patterns and so forth. And what comes with that, I realize is the delayed grief aspect. And I mean, it talks about the death, but when I look at this in a spiritual sense, I look at the fact of the delayed grief that knowing that, let's say, a relationship was over and you can stay too long, or even if you're going through a transition with a relationship, this is where I feel like the biggest issue that has happened, because we have not learned how to better ourselves coming out of something, whether it was healthy or unhealthy attachment, domestic violence, abuse, and so forth. We were never encouraged to take a year or more for ourselves to recognize and process that which has probably delayed, that delayed processing, or that processing that has that unresolved thing that we run from, whether previously in a relationship, and then try to jump into another pattern of being with someone else. And again, it's not about shame and guilt, because I'm telling you from experience, I've done it to where now when you can have children and you come into that self-awareness, like, fuck, that's the last thing you want them to go through, is to feel like, is another thing I want to look up. Is it Stockholm syndrome? Stockholm. I think it's the Stockholm syndrome, is when you develop, yeah. And this is fucking wild, because Stockholm syndrome talks about, it is a proposed or non-clinical psychological response where victims of abuse or kidnapping develop emotional bonds, sympathy, or loyalty towards their captors of survival mechanism. That's fucking wild. Typically arises from intense, prolonged captivity, dependency for survival, and fear, often in situations involving domestic violence or trafficking. Now, this shit is fucking deep as fuck, because, oh my gosh, where do I dive into with that? Because when you're talking about people who have stayed in marriages or relationships and so forth, and then when you have systems, this is how deep it goes. When you have had systems that people don't recognize, that has literally been keeping people looping right back to their they're not so much oppressors, but the ones who inflict it. They're abusers. And when you look at systematically, that's what the fuck has been happening collectively. Because when people are going, that abuse of power that has them keep going, it's almost like they're held captive. And when you talk about an abuse of power, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and so forth, it doesn't allow them to process. And that goes, oh my gosh, what I'm getting clarity of, it's like, think about the birthing process for a lot of women. When you talk about delayed grief in a spiritual sense, them not being able to process the pain or the loss of a stillbirth, the loss of a child, even when she has gave birth, and the loss of even that child later probably coming out of the womb and transitioning and dying. Then even the fact of women going through almost like a spiritual death, which they do emotionally, mentally, and so forth. They go through this rebirth with giving birth and so forth, and they immediately are denied grief. They're denied the fact of allowing the anger, the sorrow, all things related to what they've experienced while in that process, especially when you talk about the corruption around the medical system and how they treat women, how they're misplaced and mishandled by putting them on their back, going against the natural order of things. There's so many things, again, where they were never allowed to process, whether the grief or even the emotions around the whole fucking situation. It can be very traumatic for women who are in there and they're pressured due to fear. Fear of this happening, them being cut on, them being induced with epidural. And if you haven't noticed, I have a video I created about that, what happened to my youngest sister. Where she had epidural and, it turned into something cancerous. And she's now ended up in a wheelchair because forced surgery, nothing holistic. So what we're having happen here is that we're talking about a collective in the matriarchal processing delayed fucking grief. Trying to process that which has never been processed. Ancestrally, generationally, matriarchally, patriarchally, collectively, individually. And when we're talking about the fact of people, when I talk about Stockholm Syndrome, developing emotional bonds and sympathy or loyalty towards their captors as a survival mechanism. What the fuck, bro? After you've had a traumatic experience, let's say for mothers in a hospital, right? Now you're called to just have this imaginary fantasy bond with your doctor after such a traumatic experience. You never got the time to process that shit. Delayed process. You never had the opportunity to process that which was unresolved and you kept it in your body. And when we're talking about making sense of, marked sense of disbelief when it comes to delayed grief, it's like a part of you that disbelief of what the fuck just happened to me. And so guess what comes up later? If you're not taught how to navigate through the emotions and so forth, you're going to have anger, bitterness, and sorrow. So a lot of our mothers in the matriarchal, the maternal is dealing with has nothing to do with not just men, but experiences that they've had, whether with the medical system, whether with childhood experiences, with their mother, so many different things. Now, let me get back into delayed grief. Occurs when feelings associated with loss don't come for weeks, months. So what comes up for me is postpartum, what they call. Because they give them titles, but all of this shit connects to some type of emotion. And when there's disorder, that's not order. That's not natural order. Delayed grief occurs when the feelings associated with loss don't come for weeks, months, or even years. Years after the event. Delayed grief can be hard to understand or overstand if it's not often talked about. This is fucking, bro, we fucking breaking cycles and change. I have to talk about this shit. Because when I think about this, delayed process is basically prolonged grief for a lot of people. They have never talked about or sat with the fact of a loved one or someone that they lost. And this is why I can see why so many people hold on to, and I get it. Because when you look at how much the unhealthy attachment, I gotta call it like it is, the unhealthy attachment to the physical and tangible shit, you can see the cover up of how people have created an identity around that. Gang culture, violence, and so forth. That delayed grief within them that's stored in their body that they never process, that emotion and so forth. This is where the bitterness and anger and frustration and sorrow comes from. It's like little children that never got the opportunity to cry for their animal or something that they built a bond with. And when you talk about most of the women who have been already in this wounded masculinity, and wounded masculinity for all of us, but the display of that, them never having to sit with the wounds of the feminine and they giving birth to the wounded masculinity through their actions. We're talking about women who never got to sit with what they dealt with out of fear of talking about it. That's how women have been silenced. Their inner voice. And so when you realize that this is what most of society, most of women have been dealing with sexual assault, sexual abuse, abuse in itself, so forth, coming by the hands of people that they love, and then developing fucking Stockholm syndrome through the process. I can personally say I went through that, and I put people through that shit. And I sit here and tell myself, I don't ever want my daughter to think like what I've done with not apologizing and acknowledging, because that's a part of sometimes where I've done shit and processed it later. Some people don't process it at all. And I told y'all, guess what has happened through humanity? When you have dealt with indigenous women, when you look at the origins of this earth and world, who has dealt with grief and so much, it's not to exclude other women who have dealt with, but when I see the depths of the prolonged grief, it begins with the indigenous women of these lands, naturally. They have had to delay their emotions, processing their emotions more than anybody. In the last so long. I'm not even going to say the last. And the reason I mention that is because it's not to say that other women haven't dealt with it, but I'm talking about the fact of what they've experienced through their pregnancy, their attacks on being dehumanized, devalued in so many ways. They have had to also deal with their shit on their own. And then when you talk about dealing with complex PTSD, which most of them probably have no idea that they have, and another form of escaping is through religion. Anything to avoid. Avoidance. Avoiding avoiding reminders of trauma, feelings, and thoughts, peoples, and places. Let me tell you something. If I can see how organized religion has been such a fucking master craft to cast this illusion and spell amongst the matriarchal, oh my gosh. And the reason I say that is avoiding reminders of trauma, feelings, and thoughts, and people and places. That says it all right there. In their way to avoid what really has happened to them, they'll get it and take it to whomever, and they'll talk to God, to Jesus, or somebody else, rather than having a healthy dialogue with themselves or developing that. Because it doesn't matter. I'm telling y'all, it never mattered how much a person can have this imaginary or almost like this, and this is from experience. no matter how nice and how much people have come and say they're part of this religion, they believe in God, they believe in this and so forth. But yet, they have still suppressed and avoided so much of their feelings, so much of their trauma, so much of their thoughts and so forth, to where they will take it to someone else before talking to the person or expressing it through a healthy outlet, whether that's writing it, therapy, and so forth. And I get it because it's not accessible to a lot of people. And see, I got to realize how that was purposely, intentionally done. Intentionally. Orchestrated, organized for that reason. You're talking about delayed grief. I can connect this to complex PTSD because how can I break this down? Now, delayed grief can show up in ways of physical symptoms such as weakness, trouble breathing, restlessness, immune system problems. That's very interesting because severe inability to function, work, social life, intense preoccupation with the loss, extreme guilt and self-blame, emotional numbness or emptiness, persistent avoidance of reminders, self-destructive behaviors, substance abuse, self-harm. Bro, this is the fucking same as complex PTSD. This is the same thing. Because in that process of doing that, you're just repeating the traumas. This is why I was telling y'all how so much is collapsing around the ideology of what organized religion actually is. And how it's still in people trying to look to someone else externally or go to this, whatever it is that they do, it doesn't feel the emptiness. There's still something there where, have you really regulated the emotion around the feeling? Does it really fix your intimacy problems with you having a healthy dialogue with yourself? Does it really fix your feeling of guilt just because you told God or someone else about it? I'm just asking. Because you're talking about, depending on the demographics and or the person, when you're dealing with dealt with complex PTSD in certain demographics where you have been in environments where you have seen consistent abuse, whether you were, childhood abuse and neglect, domestic violence, which when we look at the fact of the bigger picture from all of this, most people ignore or want to ignore that. That's what has been fueling societal PTSD, the collective. That's what's being unveiled when you're talking about mental health awareness. Because it doesn't matter how much people go out here and hide behind their jobs, their whatever it is. These things eventually are going to rise, and that's what's happening right now. That's why it's so much of a heightened awareness around mental health and wellness right now. Because a lot of these things are keeping people, they're signs, behavior signs of, delayed grief. This connects so emotional and mental signs of delayed grief or prolonged grief disorder, however you want to say it. Unhealthy grief, often called complicated or prolonged grief, involves intense, persistent symptoms that disrupts life for months or even years. Oh my gosh. So not only when you're talking about people being unalive, murders, or just um, mass I won't say mass incarceration, but mass murders, or like when you're talking about the energy of this, we're we're talking about people that had to sit with this. When you're talking about the slaughtering of people in a nation, and then you're talking about the people, this anger, this bitterness, this distrust, this restlessness that people have developed. It explains why the climate is the way it is collectively. So unhealthy grief, often called prolonged grief, involves intense, persistent symptoms that can disrupt life for months, whew, or years. As I'm talking about this, I can feel it. Severe inability to function, work, social life, intense. I think I read this already. Yeah, self-destructive behaviors and so forth. While some intense feelings are normal, the severity and persistence beyond typical grieving periods, often 6 to 12 months, signals a need for professional help. And when you're talking about people who have never, ever generationally have gotten some type of professional help, and I don't just mean any professional help, because all professional help is not professional. Because that professional shit is so when you talk about people you got people that claim to be a professional and very narcissistic or not empathetic at all. They go in it for the money. They don't give a fuck about really finding a solution, especially if they have already developed, what's the word I'm looking for? They don't even know how to maintain healthy relationships with darker people or have any healthy relationship with darker people. What fucking solution or problem have we really have found? Because they're not going to care at all about finding a solution. This is basically most of the structures that have been in place. And this is where that tiredness, physical symptoms is coming up in a lot of our elders right now. When you talk about severe fatigue and digestive issues, a lot of this points out to chakra systems, a lot of things that are unprocessed and blockages in the body. Emotional and mental signals. I'm reading on delayed grief or prolonged grief in the body. Intense and lasting pain, yearning that doesn't lessen, or feelings of emptiness, bitterness, or sorrow that is overwhelming. Whew. Identity disruption, feeling like a part of yourself died with the loved one or struggling to see a future. Oh my gosh. I don't know who that was for, but much love. I'm sending you love and healing, and that was for somebody, man. I feel like when this is identity disruption, I feel like a lot of people, I mean, even myself, at a time where I was in such disbelief that I grew up with one of my cousins, and I just knew we was gonna have this life and do these things together because we had agreed to make a pact, or some of us in the trenches or grow up like we're gonna get our family out of the hood, we're gonna do this, and to find out his being unalived and how he went through it and went about it. I was still saying that I was still in disbelief that he would even do that. And now that it's being 2013, grieving is a process. It's like there is no timeline to that shit. It's been wow. That's fucking wow. Now that I think about it, it's been 13 years. Whoa. Identity disruption. Feeling like a part of yourself died with that loved one or struggling to see the future, because what that I can elaborate on that. What that really, like, if you don't know and you haven't went through that, it could have you in this state of almost like I want to use the term psychosis, but disbelief of it never happened. And I've seen connected with women. If I would approach it differently, I would. But that's a whole nother experience. But I've known of women who have, and I can relate this to people who have been sexually abused and so forth. And that goes with the delayed processing of that grief, and or experiences where this sister I knew that held on to, like, and I did this too. I held on to my cousin's obituary, the form, for so long. I just felt like if anything, and I know family who goes through this, and I recognize it now is this is what they're going through. I recognize this now as prolonged grief. Shit, I believe the mother of my children is probably going through this. A lot of people are going through this shit. When you talk about, the feeling of it, feeling extreme guilt and self-blame, oh my gosh, I probably got to do a part 2 to this. Because you can blame yourself sometimes for feeling like you didn't say enough or you didn't do this. So many things around that. The extreme guilt or how you could have did things differently. I met so many, this brings up a lot of memories of people that I know who, let's say someone who was in substance abuse, due to the fact that they couldn't process in their life through probably some type of complex PTSD where they, I knew someone who they found someone, she said she found him, but I think she overdosed. No, the person overdosed. Yeah, the person overdosed and she found him unalived. And I can tell y'all, like, this hits people different because it creates a numbness, emotional numbness, an emptiness to where they could derail and go down this road of persistent avoidance, avoiding the memory, keeping it in, which can lead to, again, substance abuse or even self-harm. This is where you can see a lot of people in that guilt or shame or blaming themselves, not shame, but in that self-blame, they could feel like in order for them to be closer to that person, they feel that they too have to do something to, whether the people who believe in heaven or, and so forth, or feel like they don't feel worthy of living, want to be there with that person, or they develop this numbness or belief that, well, if they go, I have to go too. And, a lot of this I feel like is rooted in, again, this is my opinion or perspective. It's like unhealthy attachment and not really having a balanced and healthy relationship with the spirit, spiritual aspect of who we are and the emotional and mental. And again, it's not people's fault. It's just what type of world. So many things we have avoided and were never taught young, especially the importance of having emotional stability and stabilizing and loving yourself. And there's so many different things I can go on and on, but yeah, that was what I was getting into is that individual I knew, I start to see her, it shows up in their physical, like, I'm gonna talk about a few people here, like go into detail, no names of course, but just the experience of how they responded to it. For one, the one that found their person unalive due to an overdose, I recognize now that they were definitely numbing themselves and blamed themselves and try to escape through like overworking to, you see a lot of people, not just substance abuse, but the abuse of hypervigilance or overworking themselves to try to numb what they feel, try to drink themselves through it, smoke themselves through it, or even have sex. Because if you're dealing with sexual abuse and trauma, that too is what I feel is a process of the trauma behind that unhealthy grief, that unhealthy that prolonged grief of dealing with a part of your innocence or something being stripped. So it's almost like a part of you died there for a lot of women and men. A part of you died in that place. And when you don't know how to process that or have yet processed that, you numb yourself through sexual intercourse. You can find a way to try to again, extreme guilt and blame for some people that develop that after the fact of like feeling like when it's not just people not protecting them, they can feel like it was their fault because they feel like either they should have known something or they could have done something better, and how these relationships form from that, from my interpretation, from my experience, is that you will get tripped yourself. And this is how I feel like when rape happens or sexual abuse, some people find, again, they numb themselves, and what ends up happening is that self-harm can come in a way of abuse of, because sexual abuse can be looked at two different ways or different ways. The sexual abuse is where you're not aware of your patterns. So that's self-harm in a way, because you're not aware that in your inability to connect the fact of you're disassociating from your body to where your body doesn't want this, you don't want this. But due to the fact that you never processed that prolonged grief or process that emotion, you could probably develop through Stockholm Syndrome from the abuser or whomever you were held captive from, develop this sympathy or this loyalty to the abuser. I feel like we fucking breaking so many cycles right now when I said this shit. I thought I was gonna put this video off. I really may have to post this video tonight, today or whenever. But that's very vital, because a lot of what is the illusion that are shattering is that this could like over time through relationships and long term, you develop this complex PTSD also with the abuse continuing, because complex is a long term. You dealing with the sexual abuse for so long, or the abuser, and some people, children are developed. Domestic violence too, if you dealt with that, it talks about human, I don't know if I can say that on YouTube, like how could I say that? Trafficking. And just a lot of things again can be looked at so many different ways, like whether you want to call it polarity or duality, a duality of things. It's like I've noticed that even with going back to the person that I know, I was getting into how her teeth was rotting, and I felt like that came from the physical symptoms of trying to escape through substance abuse, like not really caring. And those who know that are spiritually in tune, we know that says a lot about your spiritual hygiene. That says a lot about your mental and emotional well-being. And This is where you see weight loss, a lot of things show up in people. Basically, how they that unhealthy grieving can show up in these persistent symptoms, or the consistency of that. And yeah, so going back to the identity disruption, um, if it has happened like with a loved one transitioning, that could look different from someone who dealt with a sexual abuse or trauma, who's it mentioned how identity disruption through emotional and mental signs of delayed grief is feeling like a part of yourself died with that loved one, or struggle to see a future. That's really deep, because some people can't, aren't haven't processed what has been suppressed or pushed down, to where no matter how far they go, no matter what type of relationships they go in, it's like they carry this memory for so long about this individual. And people do it, and I'm getting clarity of stuff. People do this in relationships where it could have been a loved one or a person that was in a relationship with. I had a situation where someone I knew that had a seizure, and I could see how some people immediately dive or jump into relationships because they haven't processed it. And the only way to numb themselves is through jumping into another relationship, which they don't see a sign of self-abuse, because they're not allowing themselves to actually process that which is unresolved from that incident or experience. And so what ends up happening, like I said, through sexual abuse, is that I went through it, to where a person who knowingly did not want, we finna break a huge cycle when I say this. People who knowingly did not want sex, you can have a woman or individual, or you can have in certain instances, whether it's woman or man, or whether you subscribe to that or not, gender, you can have someone where, due to things that are unprocessed, they're unconsciously not realizing, like, in their inability to process the fact of them from having been sexual abuse, and them numbing themselves to try to connect with other people, whether it's prostitution, sex work, and whatever it is, however they go down there, their intention, sometimes they feel their intentions are pure, but not realizing that that other person can become a victim of sexual abuse. Because this is why you can hear, and I'm not saying all of this, I'm just saying for some people who don't realize, like, in your inability to have processed this abuse that happened to you, you abuse others by not acknowledging it. So you're in a relationship or in something to where, through your processing, delayed processing later, you can feel this shame and guilt around, when you're talking about the shame and guilt around what happened to you, the self-blame, blaming yourself for what happened to you through that sexual abuse, to where now you will find yourself blaming the other person. And this is where you can get these false accusations that come from someone saying that this person did this to me. And that's why you have had this loop of, it's so easy for women, not all, to say these very things and be able to skate off, be able to get away, or what do they call that shit? Skate free, or, get off with saying this, because what happens is, a lot of women have dealt with this unresolved thing. Some of them don't even realize that they have been sexually abused or touched on and so forth. So when you're talking about dealing with the grief behind that and never processing, you can develop this anger and bitterness towards not only the person, but sometimes unconsciously you will develop a self-image towards men, feeling like all men are like that. If that makes sense. Because if your self-concept or your development of seeing men healthily is not coming from, well, seeing men from a holistic or healthy place, and that was never established young, then darling, you naturally will have whatever is unprocessed or unresolved. You will naturally not know how to stabilize, healthy boundaries or healthy relationships with men. Same goes for men. And through this process, I guarantee you a lot of people coming from these boomer generations and so forth that work and have dealt with abuse firsthand, who have literally developed an identity around struggling with trying to even live a life. This goes back to unresolved or delayed grief or unhealthy grief. The identity disruption is where you have people, not just deaths, but people who have been through sexual traumas where they don't see a future. They struggle to see a future without their abuser. Oh my gosh, that shit just hit me. And when you have this in relationships, partnerships, or even like marriages and so forth, and especially if you have kids involved, this has been one of the biggest things that a lot of women are fearful of, living without the abuser. And I witnessed this with a girl who carried the obituary of her sexual abuser. Even though she was in relationships and had other relationships with other men, I realized that in her inability to process what ends up happening, this is where the Stockholm syndrome comes in. She developed sympathy for the person who hurt her. She developed this dependency, and what ends up happening, people develop this dependency to survive, and they perceive it as thriving. And they develop this survival and fear around the situation, whether it's through some type of abuse. And that right there, for me, when I look at the prolonged grief, I recognize a lot of these patterns of, when I look at the mother wound, what a lot of people have dealt with, where you feel you blame, I went through that process of blaming myself, trying to process the fact of coming out of survival. Do I blame myself for not having a relationship with my mother? No. I realized that in that grieving, in the identity that I created, I had to realize that I had to develop. I realized I struggled with trying to create a future without that woman. A lot of you, because of you feel the guilt and you blame yourself for something that you cannot control. Whether that's through a death, that's where the spiritual death and rebirth comes in, aspect of that, where you have to allow that where you develop this unhealthy attachment or dependency out of a survival mentality from an abuser who neglected, abandoned, and did all these things to keep you from really developing your own identity around who it is you're called to be, your purpose. And when you have long-term effects with that shit, again, that grieving process could take weeks to even sometimes years. This is why a lot of us are coming through that no contact of a parent or do that no contact of an abuser. The process starts there. A therapist was telling me that. She said, oh, yeah, just because you got away or just because, you don't have no contact with someone, that's where the real inner work or shadow work, I tell y'all, happens. It's where a lot of this stuff comes up now, where you're realizing, damn, this delayed processing of the emotions, all these things that's come out of nowhere. You around people so much growing up that you never process the shit that happened in those relationships. So I can see why people at all don't want to deal with people, or this. If it took them years to process this shit, it may take them years to recover. There's no timeline on that. Then when you talk about, again, going back to the fact of me seeing how even through that sexual abuse, where most people are unaware that they're not only abusing themselves, but they develop this survival mechanism to where they use these things to prey on men, or men use these same mechanism to prey on women, predatory behavior, trap them with children. All of this is a form of abuse, self-abuse, because in there thinking that they're trapping, whether man or woman, creating a child, it eventually backfires, because what ends up happening is that whatever unprocessed or unresolved, whether mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, is going to be exposed regardless of who you are. So I felt like that's why I went through even some connections I went through, that realizing having so much trust issues around women is because I start to process things later and realizing like, oh shit, I was sexually abused, or I was abusing financially in so many different ways, in ways where you have women who have developed a mindset around using men just for what they have. And it's never talked about to that depth. And then you ask yourself, well, where did they develop this belief system? So and this is why you can see patterns of people who, through numbness, knowing that they've been sexually abused, most of the people who've been sexually assaulted or so forth, through their numbness, it talks about feeling disconnected from your emotions or activity that once mattered. This happens a lot with people. So this is why they feel like they can go out there and have sex and without thinking that they're not gonna make, they'll have sex with, how could they say, like, how people say, oh, just F them, girl, just go on to the next, da da da. And basically, they're just teaching you a pattern of dissociate or disconnecting from your emotions. Like, don't have no emotions in it when there's emotions in everything. We have an emotional body. We have emotions. We were birthed from the emotions of our mothers, inherited their emotions and so forth. So now, with that stupid ass analogy or belief system, things that you now you don't went, through this behavior of developing shit through from a lower nature, people just going out here, hyper vigilant or hyper sexualizing themselves, women, which I really realized that a lot of them don't realize collectively. It's not all, because sensuality and sexuality is different. I'm talking about embodying sensuality, the feminine attributes, never not needing to have to prove the flow or those things. So this is where I can say like the Jezebel, or the energy of someone who really is empty inside. So they're trying to numb themselves through relationships, through sex and so forth. So now they just thinking like this is going to be a fling. And in reality, they don't really, it's just another way to not process the emotions that truly mattered from the previous connection if they dealt with a heartbreak, if they dealt with something. So a lot of these things, when I'm talking about prolonged grief in a spiritual sense, this is what I'm like diving into, is that it's a spiritual thing before you see it physically. All these things where it talks about preoccupation with loss, extreme guilt, and so forth. These are things spiritually, emotionally, mentally, and so forth. All these things just show up in the body. Guilt, blame, hopelessness, disbelief, unenlivened thoughts, behavior signs, severe avoidance. Imagine when people start to really process the fact of what really happened to them in their childhood. Then now that shit hits you, now you sit with it. Now you develop this severe avoidance, refusing to talk about the person. Damn. Refusing to talk about the person, visit familiar places, or touching belongings. What?
Okay, so this is talking about the prolonged grief and death. But I can see this in so many different ways when it comes to abuse in itself. Because from my personal experience, I'm going through that currently. I don't even want to talk to my mom. And then I had to deal with the fact that one of the most challenging things I had to navigate through was visiting the homes where the abuse happened. And then just imagine people who dealt with, the prolonged the prolonged the prolonged the prolonged grief of dealing with someone who transitioned. And what comes up for me is women who have dealt with a stillbirth or went through a miscarriage. How they feel, they go through all these different things. And I know a lot of women are going to relate to this, go through all this. They're in disbelief because they have these high hopes of this child. Feeling like life isn't worth living, or wish you had, mothers go through that. Wish they had possibly went with their child. Hopelessness, the guilt and shame around it. They do something, that could have, the intense self-blame or believing they could have prevented something differently. The numbness of disconnecting from themselves emotionally instead of processing the grief in itself, or from that miscarriage and so forth, or from that experience. Oh shit, this comes up with a lot, bro. Now let me go back into this sister that I knew, which makes so much sense now. I look at her experiences so much. I realized a lot of shit I went through, I misjudged or even came to people harshly because my approach was just different. But at the same moment, now gaining this different awareness, I realize how I'm supposed to use it, like for the betterment of all, especially the matriarchal. When you're talking about women dealing with miscarriage or stillbirth, that's something I cannot say as a man that I know anything about, like when it comes to the anatomy or autonomy or just anything around that. I can only just speak about the fact of what was shared to me, but in the emotional empathy, even though I'm not a woman genetically, I can connect to the emotion of feeling and then finding a solution by actually trying to connect deeply and express that I too may not know everything about your experience, but I see you, I appreciate you, I value you. So I want to talk about the things that were never talked about, whether from a spouse, a friend, a father, when you have went through these things. That's what the healing is about. So going back to the experience of the sister, let me see where I am on my phone. With the sister who that told me she went through a stillbirth. I'm like, what? Because sometimes we go through our own experiences and we just be like, yeah, whatever, da 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 da. But I had to go through the experience where she opened up her home. Shout out to her and her mother. Like, she opened up her home. And this is not judgment at all. It's the fact of the living conditions. But it makes so much sense because at a time where I'd be like, how the fuck can people live like this or do this? But I'm recognizing the things that were, I realized what she was experiencing was prolonged grief. And I could not decide for her how long that could take, especially when you're talking about a life. And from my understanding and overstanding, she said that she was giving birth or gave birth and didn't know until like in the ambulance, like when she gave birth to the child, and the child was like a stillbirth. Like, fuck. And so we're talking about, even after that, I can see how so many women will want to try again due to the fact of the extreme guilt or self-blame. Not all, but wanting to feel something again or replace that. To replace that emptiness. I can see why they could go into self-destructive behaviors, because the thing I talk about with this is like, if they don't have no support system around that, no emotional support system, no healthy emotional support system, then fuck. They don't know any better. Especially if they don't have a partner. That brings up another sister that I know again. Well, let me finish this one, but I realized the way she was navigating through that, I recognize now through the numbness, because in the home at that moment it was so much mold. There was no ceiling. There was a ceiling, but it was discarded. And she also in the closet held on to, and it was like the stuff was molded, and like she held, I don't know how long she held on to this too, but you can tell it been there. She held on to, damn, this brings up why people go through this in hoarders. But she held on to what was supposed to be for the child, like the thing I believe she purchased or got gifted. And she held on to like the car seats and some other stuff, because in his back, it was a trailer, but in his back door, it was dark. And I start to recognize, like, through this gloominess and darkness had a lot to do with me recognizing now, it reflecting her internal world of what she was feeling, or what she disconnected from, believing that the child was not going to physically be here. That disbelief or in denial. And that's why I realized she was struggling with, the identity disruption, struggling with the fact of feeling like a part of her like died with that child, or with that child, and so forth, and struggling to see a future without it. And that's why I see how people can connect themselves to items, or touching things and so forth. As it mentioned how severe avoidance is refusing to talk. No, not behavior science. It talks about touching belongings. And I don't see she had an issue with that, but I can see with the opposite of holding on, they don't see it as an unhealthy thing. And I can see how, like, with hoarders, how they talk about the psychological thing of, I forgot what they call the disorder, but it's a certain disorder where they hold on to things and they're not, cognitively, or the neurotransmitter, something's not processing there to where they see actually something wrong with the situation, or how it's affecting them and everyone else around them. And the reason I had to go through that is because I was also going through, I can say, grieving being away from my daughter. Because in that process, this is what I came to the conclusion of, even though her mom and her was there, I felt like me coming there and my trying to restabilize my life, or just her open up that door, had a lot to do with her yearning for someone to fill that void. She wanted affection. And whether she knew this or not, I knew that she possibly wanted to have sex to fill that void and bring another child in. Because again, there was something I paid attention to even the other girl that I talked about. I noticed this thing where her hygiene wasn't the best. And I believe that just came from the numbness. I mean, she even came out and told me it's been a process. So I'm not saying this at all to judge her or say she's disgusting and all. It has nothing to do with that. She came out and was saying like how even when it happened, she didn't bathe or take a bath for like I don't want to say months, but for weeks. And I was like, what? And I realized, like, it was just the disbelief. in accepting what has happened with herself, her body, the emotions. Like when women go through things, it's not the same as men. We go through things completely different. We master logic, they master emotion. We're both not, have logic and emotion, but I recognize the fact that she was in disbelief. And this is why I realize we distract ourselves with through some type of substance abuse or external things, whether with relationships, where we don't know how to process things, where we jump into something. I'm telling you personally, like even when I went through abuse and I didn't recognize a lot of things or know that I thought that was normal, I would literally leave something and go into something without processing it. But then I also realized, like in that Stockholm syndrome, where I realized connecting it to the mother wound, I developed over time, didn't even realize like this emotional bond or this unhealthy attachment I had that I had to dissolve over time. I actually had sympathy for the person that inflicted the pain. Or I also realized that now that it was a part of me trying to live with someone or stay with someone, it was a part of survival mechanism, something I developed, learned behavior. And I also started to realize like um, prolonging the captivity, prolonging the dependency to the connection for survival from a place of fear, because that codependency is rooted in fear. And so I realized that, it was a way of my brain trying to process or not knowing to that delayed processing these emotions. I realized I was not allowing myself the time, the duration to sit with these things, to recognize my role and also to recognize the role of other people. Whew. So, yeah, shit's real. Um, and even with that, as I'm reading more of the Stockholm Syndrome, it talks about how people would defend the abusers or struggle with breaking free, and realizing like it says like quoting, I was just trying to survive. And once we realize a lot of these foundations structurally, spiritually too, because people go through this through spiritual community, physical, any types of physical communities, people go through this shit. And over time, they get so consumed in the survival of it, and they begin to protect or even have this distorted reality around accepting this as being normal, which is fucked up. And so, yeah. So with that, going back to that situation with that sister, like now that I'm able to distance myself because I start to really pay attention to, again, in that environment, it really showed me now that I had to be there for the duration, but I also realized in that situation that I could not save someone through what they had to experience, because deep down they were trying to pull me or lure me in almost into accepting their distorted reality or accepting that their reality was mine. And that can be very difficult when people are trying to remove themselves or trying to find a sense of self-awareness or develop an identity around something more healthy. So I'm gonna continue reading on these prolonged griefs. Can also involve social withdrawals, isolated from friends and family's activity. That's kind of like normal that people do. Inability to function, struggling with work, self-care, or daily routines. Compulsive behaviors, over-functioning, workaholicism, or excessive use of distractions, social media, TV. Fuck. Whoa. And that's why I tell you, like, in your learning what you've been surviving, or not realizing you have built these foundations that were abusive, that preyed on our childhood wounds, and then we having to interact with these people. A lot of these people aren't aware of their learned behavior patterns, of their shit. And some of us never knew, especially how to process things while we were in it, and then to learn how to choose healthy partnership, how to rise above it, how to build outside of that, because it's difficult when you have structures that are in place. Let's say for a man, for me, especially as a darker man, it's not about crying out for support, but there's not a lot of shit when it comes to, the reason I say looping, because it literally has been created for women to assume, and that's not to say that people haven't got out of things and they aren't thriving, but they still have to deal with, again, the delaying of the emotions or processing it even later on. But a lot of those systems are created or have been created to keep those women looping, most of them. And then now, even in that, there's not structures that are built truly to support them outside of now them having to be a single mother, or them being single, or even things that where there's structures in place that are empathetic, to where, again, if you're talking about delayed grief, we're talking about the fact of people that person may need years, months to recover from whatever traumatic experience, and never having it. So now they're trying to process this, that's what's unresolved, and now they're holding on to this rage, this anger. Now it's coming out. Now they don't even realize like how they're going to function in the workplace. So now that's why you see a lot of overhaul, and what a lot of elders and a lot of people don't even know what they're doing, because they're trying to distract themselves with, let's say, social media, TV, substance abuse, or even another relationship, or even working. This is a pattern. So now what ends up happening, which I was already going to talk about, is the physical signs: fatigue, extreme tiredness, because these things that are unresolved are showing up. It talks about sleeping issue, insomnia, or nightmares. When I've seen these things have happened to people, I realize, like, it makes me bring up the fact of what happened with my grandmother. Like, when you have had the stories I've heard from my mother and grandmother, like the abuse, my mom telling me like she was held at knife point, like they say gunpoint, and somebody didn't want her to leave. We're talking about the fact of like, this woman has went through so much to where she was basically dependent on these men and in these relationships for survival. And no one has ever shown her or held space for her. Fuck. And I realize, I see why she has this, well, I tell y'all, I call it enmeshment, not enmeshment, but this incessive connection that people don't realize mothers have with their sons, or, they smother them, or they do things, whether intentionally or unconsciously, to hinder their growth, because they're the only safe haven or safe place for them. And in their inability to really, because I'm telling you, I've never seen things where my mom really processed things, like not been in a relationship with herself. I'm telling y'all, I'm 36. I've never not seen her in some shit with someone, because I will always hear about, with this person, that person, this would happen. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this shit is like dealing with that complex PTSD. These are repeated patterns. This is repeated trauma. And then I had to recognize it, to whether you're talking about developing this subconscious or inheriting this emotionally, or seeing it young, and it can look different from a man, to where you'll build connections or have built connections with women to where they unconsciously smother you, or you're building trauma bonds. Phew. And I've noticed through, again, it talks about physical signs, digestive problems, nausea, stomach pains, appetite changes, immune weakness, more frequent to colds or infections. Like I said, you don't have to accept none of this to be true, but physical symptoms, headaches, muscle tension, irritation, disease, physical element. I feel like I said it right. So even with this, because I'm about to finish up here, even with all of this, I'm just showing y'all like how a lot of us are currently or have currently dealing with shit that we have no knowledge of. And then the fear around even trying to seek support without motherfuckers being thrown in the same, and what do you call that shit, into a nut house, or, into a place because they're dealing with shit. Because everybody, like, immediately they want to throw people, put them on medication. And, everyone's going to have their opinion and perspective on that, because I don't want to go down that rabbit hole of certain things. I just only speak about what I've experienced and what I'm going through and so forth. And again, this brings awareness to my own patterns, what I can relate to, what I've been doing to distract myself. Shit, it even made me have a change of heart and mind to what I even want to indulge in, because I'm realizing and regulating my nervous system and resting more, these things come up. So I'm able to recognize people who are dealing with this shit and never got the opportunity to sit the fuck down. Because when you talk about behavior signs, I know so many people right now that have dealt, that are working themselves to death. They're over functioning compulsively. That's why it's so easy to say, how people, man, my homeboy, this is for you, da 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 da, shout it, this is for da da da. And then they go and chasing the bag or overhaul. And I get the inspiration, but have you processed that shit? I see so many relatives of mine, like, a lot of stuff, and people are coping through their own way. It's just a lot of stuff they due to dissociating or still in disbelief, they don't want to accept. They almost use this death as an honor of their accomplishments or whatever it is, which I can see the correlation in why they do that, or I almost said like things ancestrally, but it's more so the bigger picture of, but are you recognizing the signs, whether physically and so forth? I see this shit so much with, like, that's why I can see from afar what's going to happen to a lot of people. What I've been telling y'all about how a lot of people transitioning and so forth, they're dealing with not just unresolved emotions, but this is the big one right here. This prolonged grief for a lot of people. When you talk about people coming from wars and dealing with shit and the PTSD around that, and then other people dealing with the complex PTSD of dealing with other stuff growing up, the abuse around that, people dealing with that from a father or mother that was in a war, or, women that have dealt with that. Oh my gosh. I gotta make a part 2 of that, because that's something as well. This shit got me thinking about even the fact of, like, knowing what I went through, knowing what I, put out there. And I talk about this because I don't have shame and guilt at all around what I've experienced or my experiences. I've had to sit with them and still navigate through them, because I don't know the process it's going to take for those women and or people at the hands of my inability to process or know that I had unresolved shit. I don't know I cannot give them a timeline. And I'm not at all bothered by them not ever wanting to interact or engage and so forth, because it's just like a child. When you dealt with something, depending on where you are, there's it's like we're teaching our children, like going back to that Stockholm syndrome, to develop a loyalty and so forth. That makes me think about the fact of like how we're taught to brush shit up under the rug and just forgive and forget, and that's your mom, that's your dad, that's your this and that. And again, that's another way of not being able to process um, what needs to be processed, like emotionally, the anxiety around developing a dysregulated nervous system, that feeling of not feeling safe, like fuck. And again, like the reason why this is so important is because people are dealing with this daily in relationships and so forth. I dealt with it, and then when you're trying to navigate through it, again, when you have had systems in place that is not trying to pour back or pour into those who are literally have went through these experiences, and there's nothing to like really support them longevity through those experiences. I'm not talking about a retreat. That's a part of it. I'm talking about the fact of why people want to isolate, seclude themselves for so long, because of what they've experienced and what that prolonged grief and so forth. But I'm definitely gonna make another video and stuff on this because it's vital. But just know you are needed. The world needs you. You are valuable. You are loved. A lot of things were not your fault. A lot of us, in coming into, you want to call it awakening, enlightenment, or self-awareness, or this healing journey, whatever you want to call it. Everyone's going to go about it differently. Just know that you have to give yourself grace. It can be different for people. Like I said, I had to personally deal with the fact of when I was in things I didn't want to see. Now I'm needing to see. So now I realize that fear and doubt could come up, blaming myself because I didn't, how you didn't know how to tell yourself because you didn't have like this healthy self-concept of who you are. So some of us can blame ourselves from why a relationship or connection, the loss, because there's a death that goes through that spiritually and physically, of the old version of yourself. To where now these doubts or certain things of, well, why couldn't I do this, or why this didn't operate? And in reality, like the new reality or acceptance, as you realize when you were living in survival or try to stay loyal to whether you were self-abusing or you were being abused, you start to realize like you develop in that process a new sense of awareness, worthiness, integrity, authenticity, having the courage to move through that and pass it, and not feeling, because you may have to go through that illusion of guilt or emotions that may come up. That's the processing part that has been delayed. And so now you're telling yourself like, oh, I'm seeing clearly now this illusion I was living in. I'm seeing now to where the oversaturated term narcissism, but seeing your role most importantly, to where now I'm able to see that I do deserve better for myself. Knowing that what I've experienced, knowing how much I've ignored, knowing how much I've repressed. And fear will come up around that. And fear is facing everything and running to what's familiar, whether that's running away. Familiar could be through substance escapism, or even staying in something, prolonging it. Or literally just the patience of knowing that it's all unfolding in divine timing and trusting that process. So that comes with patience, faith, self-care routine, self-love. And for some of us, it's going to be different aspects, different journeys, different ages, and so forth, and that's okay for wherever you are. Also, yeah. What else? Yeah, and it's okay for those things to come up because for me, I start focusing more towards, and it's not from a distracting place. It's focusing more for what I deserve and desire, so that I could come into the fullness. I tell myself that I'm like, you know what, I'm ready to be on a timeline or in a place on my journey where I can actually come into this fullness of who I am, my full expression, and honor that and embody that unapologetically with integrity, with authenticity, on a level of where there are souls, people, humans, whomever you are, who are ready to receive these messages, who are ready to receive the uncomfortability of what they've been in and to recognize the fruit within themselves that has been rotten, the emptiness, to now that they can water themselves, pour back into themselves, and give prosperously, but knowing how to pour into themselves and be able to balance that. So for me, again, it's the bigger picture. I love this shit. I honor it. And then again, that fear comes up, but that shouldn't keep you from planting the seeds towards looking into that direction and aligning with, taking that initiative to how you're going to exit that relationship. Because, I had to get to a place where I thought all of my relationships being to what I never knew how to process, but now I'm processing later now to where they had to be combative or they had to be disruptive or they had to be anything that's disharmony. And in reality, I felt like they had to be chaotic and come to that awareness of myself that reflected me. No, I make the decision that this transition now is in my hands. It starts with me, my initiating. It starts with realizing that I set the intentions for this transition to be blissful and beautiful. And if it's otherwise, in how that person reacts to that, it's beyond my control. I still have to go towards my bliss and listen to my heart. That's the honor and beauty of integrity and taking back your power. Because a lot of these things I express is showing people the dark side or the shadow side of things, only for you to realize you're still that light in there. You. What was the one about identity disruption? One of the most difficult things that people struggle with, and I love identity disruption, is that being able to see a future without whether said person, people, and so forth for the betterment of your well-being. Whether that's through a death, a loss, an abuse, relationships, so forth. That's the most challenging thing to navigate through because you will have to go through a grievance. And then when the longer you prolong it, I feel like the more you prolong the relationship. That's from experience. The more you try to prolong and overstay it's like the grief in itself, overstaying is welcome. And when your higher self or future self or whatever you want to call it is calling you, it knows better because it's telling you I'm deserving of this new home where it's peace and I'm deserving of this new environment where I am appreciated and celebrated. I'm deserving of this. And then that unknown is that emotional aspect of diving deeper to where sometimes you don't know how it's going to come, but you know that I always say this affirmation: everything is conspiring and for the highest good of myself and all involved. Everything is working out for me, in my favor, for the good of all, to the harm of none. I say, and so be it. Because a lot of us as cycle breakers and generational curse breakers, we're having to navigate through this shit and having to see the bigger picture. And it's going to be very uncomfortable. Got 5 minutes, but it will become very uncomfortable for that let's say, people say entity, low vibration, or even the cycles, as you're breaking the cycles, it could become louder. It could become a tug of war because, again, you have to keep affirming yourself that what is familiar? Am I trying to do something out of survival? Or am I just doing something from a place of, feeling like I have to distract myself? And these things just become more clear. That's why we got to give ourselves grace. I had to go through it. You're not exempt. There's no shortcuts. But for me, you'll know when you're ready, because it won't be excuses. You'll be tired. You get tired of trying to serve that old version of yourself. So I told myself, like, yeah, I'm ready. Whenever it comes, because I've known myself to do that, but I also learned through self-worth and self-value that knowing that I desire much more better, even when opposition or someone else try to tell me differently. And so, yeah, fear is facing everything and running, or facing everything and rising above it. And no one else is going to do it, because I've learned in abusive relationships or connections or anything as such, in someone trying to hold you captive, it's like that which they were battling with or internally battling with is holding them captive, and it wants to hold you captive too. So they don't want to, in that identity disruption, want you to be able to see a future without, what's familiar. And that's the survival. They don't want you. And that's when you have to take the initiative to create in your mind's eye, in your day-to-day routine, in being holistic and showing up for yourself. You're actually telling yourself energetically and spiritually that this is what I'm ready for. I'm ready for this. So I'm going to pack up. I'm going to prepare myself through that duration. I'm going to do certain things that is, telling my higher self or telling the universe or whatever it is, the higher power, I'm ready. So in that's when you can either repeat the trauma or cycle by trying to do what's familiar. And so, that's the biggest one. That identity disruption, oh my gosh. It's being able to see a future, to create a future or see a future without, without what was familiar to you. So that's all I got to say. Y'all take care of yourself. Peace and blessings. Shalom.